That night, the city burned under a merciless sky. The last caliph finally understood that thrones can die. What he believed was divine protection became nothing. Only drifting ashes remained of his sacred shadow, carried away by the dark, indifferent river. Weeks earlier, he stood unchallenged in those golden halls. Raising his hand brought immediate submission from everyone. He believed his power was permanent and unbreakable, that the walls around him would last forever, and that his shadow alone could guard the world. The markets pulsed with life and endless possibility. Scholars debated ideas under the shade of palm trees. Scribes preserved centuries of wisdom on fresh pages. Baghdad was the living heart of human knowledge, and he believed himself its untouchable, eternal guardian. He chose to ignore the repeated warnings from the east, convinced that his city was untouchable and eternal. His confidence had grown taller than the ancient walls, his illusion stronger than any army that could come. The first heavy stones began striking the distant walls. The ancient fortifications shook with violent, continuous force. Thick dust forced its way into the royal palace. He ordered prayers and closed his eyes to reality, the reality that was coming faster than he could accept. Flames rose violently through the outer districts, where life had once flowed freely and brightly. The screams of women and children pierced the palace walls. He demanded victory verses be recited louder, as if words could silence the fear already inside. The messengers returned with exhausted, ashen faces, carrying a final refusal that offered no hope. He stood in heavy silence for long moments, then ordered the granaries filled with everything possible, as if death could be bargained with or starved. The horizon vanished behind an endless sea of soldiers. The ground trembled violently beneath their march. Baghdad's ancient towers shook with unprecedented force. He stared at the sky in long, heavy silence, finally grasping how deeply he had misjudged everything. He stood alone in his private chamber, surrounded by old maps and ignored letters. Warnings he had dismissed as weakness now lay scattered across the table. He touched one of them with trembling fingers, then pushed it away. For a moment, something inside him wavered, but he quickly gathered the letters and threw them into the fire. The flames rose, and with them, the last chance to see clearly. Hulagu emerged like a colossal shadow in the mist. His presence arrived long before his army. It pressed against the palace walls and the hearts inside, a silent warning that the end had already begun. The Kang took one slow, deliberate step forward. The ground shook violently beneath him. The air inside the caliph's throat turned to ice, and fear spread through his body like winter. The armies closed around the city like a merciless iron noose, squeezing the breath out of every street and soul. The air inside the palace grew unbearably heavy. Silence became heavier than any scream that came before. Everything whispered that the end had already begun. He stood directly before Hulagu with nothing left to hide behind, their eyes locked in a silence heavier than death. In that crushing moment, every illusion shattered at once. The ignored warnings, the blinding arrogance, the fatal miscalculation. Reality stood before him wearing the face of the conqueror. There was no longer any room for self-deception. They seized him roughly and rolled him into the heavy carpet. The world vanished in an instant of pure terror. Only the frantic beating of his heart remained, like war drums echoing inside a sealed tomb. No throne, no power, no title left. Just a man trapped in absolute darkness. The hooves began pounding the earth around him without mercy. Each strike shook his body with brutal force, bringing back the faces of terrified innocent children and books of knowledge floating like ghosts on the river. Everything he had lost was returning to haunt him. In the darkness, his ancestors' faces passed in cold silence, followed by the faces of Baghdad's children he failed to protect. The pressure on his chest grew heavier without mercy, as if every mistake he made had returned to strangle him. In these final moments of his life, something deep inside his chest broke with a muffled sound. Caliphate, throne, and all glory vanished in one moment, leaving only a man stripped bare before his own failures. Nothing remained to protect him from reality, just a raw confrontation with the truth he had created. In the suffocating darkness, shadow slowly moved across the broken body, a body that no longer resembled the ruler he once was. Baghdad flickered one final time in the distance, then gradually faded beneath a heavy blanket of ash. This was the painful end of God's shadow, consumed together with the city he could not save. Only ashes remained. In the painful end, God's shadow burned completely with Baghdad. History now carries one deep, unhealing scar. Power is the greatest illusion of all, and man alone bears the full weight of his fall, forever. In the end, the fall did not come from swords, but from the moment a man believed he was greater than truth. Power offers no protection from one's own blindness. Questions that remain: how many warnings do we ignore just to stay comfortable? And when does a person become blind to their own downfall while still believing they are winning? And you, which shadow are you still protecting, even though you know it will one day burn?